It had slight sweep back on the wings, 18 degrees of sweep. And it had many innovative features. For example, it had powered controls on the ailerons, which were unusual. We didn't have that at that stage in the war in any Allied aircraft.
Now Luftwaffe officials are eager to take another look. When Dornier tells Milch that the aircraft flies at over 470 miles per hour, the Air Force chief, knowing Dornier is a man of his word, agrees to the project. It is there, where the contract is given to the aviation genius to make 20 arrows, that the 335 is born. Lack of creativity and innovation. Of all the German Luftwaffe's faults during the Second World War, these two charges can never be leveled against them. Until the very end, both its aircraft and the men behind them symbolize the endless possibilities of what can be accomplished. The traditional barriers that exist are crossed, the rule book thrown out of the window. No is never taken for an answer. And never did an aircraft exemplify this doctrine more than the Dornier 335. It is a revolutionary design by a revolutionary designer. The Arrow, as it is known, is the first to incorporate engines at both the front and back of the fuselage. This push-pull concept makes it considerably more powerful than any Allied plane during this time. In fact, it has the potential to be the fastest piston-engined aircraft ever built. Unfortunately for the Third Reich, it is an aircraft that is up against the hourglass. Time for development and production is not on its side. With the tide turning in favor of the Allies, can this new and revolutionary design arrive in time to be a difference maker? Will it save the fatherland? The secret history behind the Dornier 335 can now be told. Prepare to fly, straight as an arrow. As the 335 is presented to the Luftwaffe, Dornier proclaims, "This is a secret project, something that would have been illegal 10 years ago." In order to understand the history behind this aircraft, one must look at the person pulling its strings. For the Arrow's true origins date back a generation. The story behind it begins almost 60 years before with the birth of its founder. Claude Dornier, the son of a French father and a German mother, comes to age at a time when aviation is capturing the public's imagination on every corner of the globe. As the 20th century progresses, like many individuals, he believes that these new devices are full of endless possibilities that can change the course of history. For Dornier, it is an invention that symbolizes man's creative will to advance society for the better. Beginning as an engineer for Count Zeppelin, he, along with his brother Maurice, established the Dornier Aircraft Company in 1914. It is almost fitting that as the son of two parents from bordering nations, his company is based near Lake Constance, a breathtaking piece of land located on the border between Germany and Switzerland. It is here where Dornier creates some of the greatest aircraft imagined, with a particular distinction for seaplanes.
The important thing here to remember is that at the end of the First World War, Germany was forbidden to build any more military airplanes, and there was a complete ban on any kind of military aviation.
Despite the chains placed on Dornier and the other German aircraft manufacturers due to the Treaty of Versailles, he is able to circumvent these laws by building restricted airplane parts on Swiss territory. As a result, Dornier planes become a symbol of excellence, not only in quality, but in thinking outside the box.
I found them very quiet, very efficient. I think it had everything in its favour, and the extraordinary thing was it was very lovely to land, because as you came in to approach, it was very smooth and quiet. It didn't have floats on it, on the wings and such. What it had, as most of the Dornier boats did have, was sponsons. In other words, out of the side of the fuselage came what would look like stub wings, but they were sponsons on the water. And they were rather nice, gave a nice stability to the aircraft on the water.
Though brilliant as a designer, he is equally gifted in the art of self-promotion. Having the first German plane land in England since the end of the First World War is evidence of Dornier's ability to grab newspaper headlines. And never is that more evident than with the public relations coup he scores with his monstrous flying boat, the Do X. With 12 motors attached to the aircraft and the ability to carry 80 passengers on board, it has the distinction of being the largest plane of its time. During a period when everyone wanted bigger and better, Dornier delivered, causing an enormous buzz amongst aeronautical experts throughout the world. For Dornier, it isn't enough to be the golden boy amongst the intellectual elite. He wants to be a household name from Berlin to Boston, from Munich to Montana, from Cologne to California.
It was once thought that such planes would be structurally impossible, but they have learned through experience that from an engineering standpoint, they are simpler and easier to build than the smaller planes. What is needed most of all at this stage in aviation is more efficient power plants. Instead of 500 horsepower motors, we should have 1000 horsepower motors. This, of course, will come. Claude Dornier.
In 1931, as both Germany and the United States enter one of the worst phases of the Great Depression, Dornier decides to take his Do X design on the road. Flying nearly 12,000 miles, his crown jewel begins a rigorous 10-month voyage from Germany to New York City in a brilliant act of self-promotion. During this time, his aircraft has the privilege of carrying the Prince of Wales on board. And when arriving in the Big Apple, his crew is enthusiastically welcomed by the city's mayor, along with thousands of New Yorkers singing his praise.
We find considerable pride that you landed in our very midst. Your flight was not a prank, but the result of steady determination to make a contribution not only to science, but to commerce. You will find hundreds of thousands of German citizens here who have made the most splendid kind of citizens. You are welcome for what they have done, as well as for what you have done. Mayor James Walker.
At this moment, Dornier is bigger than the Brooklyn Bridge and the Statue of Liberty combined. Like Lindbergh before him, he is capturing America's imagination. His name is now solidified in this economically lucrative marketplace. With Dornier's immense popularity, numerous companies line up to do business. In particular, General Motors of Detroit, who along with the Fokker Group sign an exclusive contract to build flying boats in the United States. GM executive Alfred P. Sloan, visiting Lake Constance during this time, is amazed at what this man is capable of. Dornier, seeing the Great Lakes and the Florida coast as the two most profitable regions for his flying boats, is excited at this new alliance. Despite his country being in both economic and political chaos, he is able to make a small fortune with his flying boat creations. However, as the winds of change sweep through the fatherland in 1933, he, like the rest, adapts to the new regime's wants and demands.
In 1933, the Nazis came to power, and then there was no longer any pretense. The Luftwaffe had in fact been built up by a man called Erhard Milch. In 1935, it became official, and the man made the head of the Luftwaffe, with Milch as his deputy, was Hermann Göring.
With Adolf Hitler's National Socialists having a firm grip on power by 1934, Dornier, along with rivals Messerschmitt, Junkers and Heinkel, acquiesced to the needs of a regime that intends on making increased militarization an urgent priority. It is not until 1940, however, that Claude Dornier officially becomes a member of the Nazi Party, a decision he later claims is based on intense pressure from those in the top German hierarchy. His company, as a result, moves away from his original intent of peaceful aviation and into the realm of military aircraft production, as his Nazi bosses begin an enormous build-up of guns, tanks, ships, and planes during the 1930s.
When the Nazis came to power, that's when virtually everything went back to Germany, and they just reintroduced their aircraft industries. But they'd already been developing everything so far and wide that they managed to bring everything back to Germany and continue what they'd been doing for years.
The contribution Dornier is most noted for by Second World War historians is the Do-17, also known as the Flying Pencil due to its long and thin fuselage. This bomber plane proves itself in the skies, particularly during the Battle of Britain, when the only holdout to Nazi aggression is the island nation off the coast of France. During this historically pivotal battle, Dornier's aircraft is responsible for the bombings of numerous British targets, both military and civilian. While this intense battle is being decided, across the Atlantic in the country where Dornier was praised just 10 years prior, there is an outrage amongst the Anglophiles. They discover that as he makes the planes that are killing their unofficial ally, his son, Claude Dornier Jr., is studying automobile production in Detroit and planning to attend university in New York. With President Roosevelt receiving intelligence briefings from the British during this time, with numerous references to Dornier aircraft being used by the Axis, the notion that his kin is given shelter and access to strategically important factories in the United States disgusts many. By early 1941, the young Dornier is told to leave. However, the secret relationship between the two does not end during this period, when America, though still officially neutral, is trying to provoke Germany into war in the Atlantic. For Dornier, though, it is his new creation that is preoccupying his time as war continues on both fronts. As 1942 comes to a close, Germany is no longer the dominant power. Now at war with the Soviet Union, they have been stopped dead in their tracks by a cold and unforgiving winter and a resurgent Red Army. On the Western Front, they have bitten off more than they can chew, with America entering the war, alongside Britain in December of 1941. Now the tide is turning against a Nazi war machine once seen as unstoppable. The United States and Great Britain are now on the North African coast, ready to invade Italy. They've been bombing German cities night and day. And what is arguably the most decisive battle of them all, Soviet troops encircle the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. In every circle of Nazi power, there is growing concern about the future. Fingers are being pointed in every direction. Claude Dornier, along with his fellow aircraft manufacturers, feel this anxiety firsthand when they are subjected to a 90-minute tirade by Field Marshal Hermann Göring.
Göring was left with a number of problems that were insoluble in reality. The fact that Germany's factories by this time were now actually themselves being bombed from the air and further production losses incurred.
In early 1943, Dornier and others are accused of total failure and deception on a grand scale. The message is clear. Solutions must be found to this problem sooner rather than later. Dornier, able to pull a rabbit out of his hat, is ready with a new design. New, that is, to those outside the loop of aviation technology. The concept of having two engines, one at the front and back, is something that he's had up his sleeve since 1937. The design's origins can be traced back to his flying boats, which incorporated a similar principle. A French company also incorporates the design during the war, with the Arsenault DB-1 aircraft, placing two propellers at the front of the plane. According to the United States Department of Commerce, the application to have the idea patented is approved by the government on October 7th, 1941, 2 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, an event that leads to a German declaration of war against the United States shortly thereafter. Considering the administration's prior knowledge about Dornier's planes being used against America's unofficial ally, Great Britain, and an undeclared war in the Atlantic between Germany and the United States, how this is approved by a nation unofficially at war with the Nazi regime may be one of the greatest mysteries of the Second World War. Visiting an impatient Erhard Milch, Dornier presents sketches for what becomes known as the 335 Arrow. The concept of having one air screw at the front and one in the tail of the fuselage was presented before to the Luftwaffe. With the war going exceedingly well for Germany during that time, interest was lacking. Now Luftwaffe officials are eager to take another look. When Dornier tells Milch that the aircraft flies at over 470 miles per hour, the Air Force chief, knowing Dornier is a man of his word, agrees to the project. It is there where the contract is given to the aviation genius to make 20 arrows that the 335 is born. As testing begins, the Hutter brothers, another duo known for outside-of-the-box solution to aircraft design, are commissioned by Dornier to construct a scaled-down version of the flying pencil. This design is where the first stage of testing is done with respect to the central thrust principle. The main logic behind its unusual design is the desire for increased speed. If an aircraft has two engines located inside the fuselage instead of at the wings, drag is significantly reduced, allowing the aircraft to fly faster. Also, if one engine malfunctions, the 335, unlike a plane with its engines attached to the wings, does not steer off course.
It had slight sweep back on the wings, 18 degrees of sweep. And it had many innovative features. For example, it had powered controls on the ailerons, which were unusual. We didn't have that at that stage in the war in any Allied aircraft. And with the reverse thrust on the prop, you could cut the landing run by about 25%.
With new technology, however, there are concerns. With the propeller located at the tail end, there is fear of it making contact with the ground, an action that damages this particular type of design. For this reason, smaller versions are being tested to make sure this does not happen to the Arrow. Looking at the A1 version of the 335, many are impressed by this fighter-bomber combination.
The Dornier 335 was a very innovative aircraft indeed, and I find it quite fascinating. When you see it on the ground, it is huge as a fighter.
Quite a large machine. I mean, the thing was huge. Again, it was not designed for subtlety. There's nothing subtle about a Dornier 335. It's a brutish airplane, very fast.
Powered by two Daimler-Benz 603 engines, the pilot is positioned between them. If hit and forced to evacuate the aircraft, an ejector seat has been installed in the Arrow. Reclined at 13 degrees and equipped with a 20G compressed air system, it ejects the pilot safely out of the aircraft, making sure he does not make contact with the tail-end propeller. It is so fast for a piston-engine plane that its top speed is even greater than the revolutionary jet-powered bomber, the Arado 234 Lightning, another Nazi secret project. Its engine may rely on traditional methods, but the outcome is anything but traditional. Equipped to carry a 500-kilogram bomb load, as well as two additional bombs on the wings, it has the potential to cause an enormous amount of destruction. The only question is its ability to be in the skies before it is too late. In times of war, priorities and needs are constantly changing, especially if one is on the losing side. And by the time the 335 Arrow is approved by the Luftwaffe, Germany begins to descend into a state of disarray that lasts for over 2 years, as Allied armies begin to close in from both east and west. As a result, Dornier's design is constantly altered by competing Air Force factions with conflicting needs and contrasting visions of what the Arrow should do. This constant tug-of-war only hurts its production. With precious time and resources scarce, an internal struggle delaying its development proves to be a fatal mistake.
The great weakness of the Nazi, if you like, bureaucratic system was that the left hand never knew what the right hand was doing. There were far too many projects being mismanaged.
It begins only days after the first 335 high-speed bomber, piloted by Hans Stieferella, flies into the air for the first time. In November of 1943, the need is for a bomber plane. 2 months later, the priority is changed to fighters and reconnaissance versions of the 335. With another 60 days comes another augmentation in the aircraft's development. Now bombers are held back indefinitely. Fighters are the priority. However, there is a debate as to what type of fighter plane is preferred: heavy fighters or night fighters. By October 1944, the latter is chosen for production. As a result, the 335 Arrow goes through numerous prototypes and variations that without question slow down production when it cannot afford to be delayed.
What were the Germans, or what were the designers thinking of? Multitudes of versions, which can be quite frustrating, want to look at them, how it was designed to keep tab of everything. There was even a 4-engine version with some sort of central section, 2 fuselages and external wings.
It is going off into so many directions that it is even spawning another monstrosity, the Junkers 635, a twin-plane design intended for long-range missions by combining 2 fuselages together, proves to be yet another mistake. The time and resources used to develop this unworkable Zwilling design by 1944 is only diverting energy away from the more realistically achievable Arrow. It becomes a case of Germany's grasp exceeding its reach. Adding to the list of concerns are the problems with the plane itself. Testers are noticing that the 335 is unable to reach its design performance objectives. It also requires large amounts of fuel, something that is not in abundance by 1944. Also, if damaged during combat, it is expensive to repair. All of these factors put together spell doom for the Arrow's future. The endgame is that the 335 never sees combat against its enemy due to these strategic blunders. The Arrow's worst enemies are not the Lancasters and flying fortresses it is supposed to shoot down. Instead, it is the Nazi hierarchy that, in a state of panic, lacks direction. In a race against the clock, the 335 Arrow loses. Despite almost 2 years of development, only 40 prototypes of the 335 are produced.
The straight version, fighter-bomber version, never saw action, as far as we know. Perhaps a few at the later stages of the Second World War, when anything could happen in Germany, 1945. A few of those might have seen action.
There is only one witness on record to see it in the sky. Pilot Pierre Klosterman, in his book The Big Show, writes that in an attempt to catch it with his high-speed Tempest aircraft, he is unable to, due to the Arrow's superior speed. That is the first and last spotting, as the project comes to an abrupt end with American troops capturing the Dornier factory at Oberpfaffenhofen in early 1945. As Nazi Germany collapses, the 335 becomes nothing more than a pipe dream, a plane whose potential remained unfulfilled. With the discovery of the 335 by Allied troops, they are eager to study its design and experience its potential. Testing the aircraft against a P-51 Mustang, they are astonished when the Arrow arrives in France more than 40 minutes ahead of its competitor.
It certainly was, up to the end of the war, the fastest production aircraft in the world, with a top speed of 474 miles an hour.
For these pilots, they are grateful that this aircraft never made it into active service. Placed on a carrier, it is hauled across the Atlantic so that this push-pull technology can be further studied, along with numerous Nazi inventions and technology that the Allies are eager to utilize for themselves. This is because Germany's enemy, the United States, is trying to perfect the technology that the Dornier 335 has mastered. The XB-42 Mixmaster by Douglas, incorporating a similar design, is brushed aside, however, with the evolution of the jet engine. As Germany surrenders and the surviving top Nazi leaders are put on trial, a program of denazification takes place throughout the war-torn nation. One man the Allies have their eyes on is the 335's creator, a person they praised 15 years before, Claude Dornier. He, like most of the top aircraft manufacturers, escapes the executioner's lever when he is acquitted at Lübeck in 1948. Looking at his previous designs, the panel renders a decision that he dedicated himself primarily to civil aviation and should not be held accountable for what was done during the war. With the ban of aircraft production lifted by the Allies in 1955, Dornier, along with others, is free again to devote his time and energy to rebuild West Germany's aircraft industry. For the next 40 years, as his country is divided by the Iron Curtain, his innovative planes once again symbolize the Western democracy's strength. Passing away in 1969, the legacy that Dornier leaves in the realm of civil aviation is undeniable. Like most of Germany's secret projects during the Second World War, the Arrow becomes a case of too little, too late. A project with so much potential, yet destroyed by those it intended to help. more than 60 years later, the 335 remains only a footnote in the history of aviation. An aircraft that historians and scholars now can only ponder about. Would it have made a difference? We will never know. There is no doubting, however, the brilliance behind its design, for it represented thinking outside the norms of aviation and not accepting the status quo. This creativeness and ingenuity is what the Dornier 335 Arrow will be remembered for in the pages of history. For decades, numerous historians have studied the Luftwaffe and its failures during the Second World War. What caused an air force that was in many ways vastly superior to the Allies to come crashing down? Is there a distinct turning point that made Germany's aerial arsenal impotent against the combined strength of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union? For the first time ever, put yourself right in the middle of the debate as we try to solve the greatest arguments in the history of aviation. What caused the Luftwaffe to fail? In 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany and later the Führer, enacting complete control over the fatherland. Eager to reclaim the lost territories taken from Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazi war machine realizes early on that the formation of a strong air force is vital. In 1935, it becomes official on paper, and the Luftwaffe is born. The man put in charge of this department is Hermann Göring, a prominent ace from the Great War.
Göring was a World War I fighter pilot. He was not interested in technology. He said something at one point, he said, well, this device is a box with coils, and I don't like boxes with coils. He's still had this sort of, well, if you're courageous and brave, you don't have to worry about technological gizmos.
In building this new air force, the Nazis possess many advantages that other nations do not, including a first-class aircraft industry, symbolized by the names Messerschmitt, Dornier, Heinkel, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf. Brilliant engineers capable of taking aerodynamics to a whole new level, and a highly educated population that can build aircraft on a mass scale. By 1938, production rises to over 5,000 planes. 1 year later, that figure soars to over 8,000, a testament to the importance Nazis place on the doctrine of air power.
What the Germans were trying to do was to employ new machines, new technologies, but to employ them in the service of a very, very old way of war that had served them well in previous conflicts and they felt would continue to serve them well in the future. I think this sets the Germans somewhat apart from neighboring countries in the 1920s and 1930s in that they are not truly looking ahead as much as they are looking back to their old traditions and grafting new technologies onto them.
Before war is declared in August of 1939, Germany's aerial arsenal is impressive to say the least. Ready to go is the Me-109, a superior single-engine fighter, the Junkers 87 Stuka, a terrifying dive bomber, the Heinkel 111 and the Dornier 17 Flying Pencil, two top-of-the-line medium-range bombers. This, in addition to the largest air transport industry in the entire world, exemplified by the Junkers 52, a workhorse that will be at the centerpiece of the German offensive. Even with all these phenomenal aircraft, a key ingredient is missing, as is often noted by Second World War historians: the absence of strategic bombers. This void does not go unnoticed in 1935, when General Walter Wever, realizing their importance, enthusiastically supports the building of long-range aircraft to battle any potential enemy, most likely the Soviet Union.
General Walter Wever was promoting what he called the Urals bomber. He believed that the industrialization, tanks, planes, etc., that was going on in the Urals area had to be demolished if you were going to win a war against Russia.
Wever writes, "Air power carries the war right into the heart of enemy country from the moment war breaks out. It strikes at the very root of the enemy's fighting power and of the people's will to resist.
Yeah, Walter Weber was very much in favour of this long-distance bomber to try and bomb Russia. And that actual project was given the name of the Ural bomber. Weber actually then put specifications out to both Dornier and Junkers for the building of this long-range bomber. Out of this came the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89. But neither of these aircraft had the performance that was currently available in the United States of the B-17 Flying Fortress. So therefore, neither of those airplanes really progressed very far beyond a couple of prototypes.
Dying due to a plane crash in 1936, his doctrine epitomized by the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89 are scrapped by Goering.
Goering, I think, didn't go along with this because he rather took the view that Hitler had, that they could win by blitzkrieg, and they wouldn't be required to get into this lengthy process of using heavy bombers.
Inquiring as to how many twin-engine planes can be made for every 4-engine one, the answer given to him is 2.5. The Field Marshal's response is that the Führer does not ask me how big my bombers are, but how many there are. It is important to note that the decision not to build long-range bombers cannot be considered a failure. For Germany, the raw materials needed to build such planes would require large amounts of rubber, metals and fuel, all of which would have to be imported for a hefty price. Of the 4,500 tons of aluminium needed per month for aircraft production, only half is available during the Weber era. The Air Force that he and others envisioned was simply uneconomic at the time. What truly represented the German way of war is instead a tactical Air Force.
The German War of Movement attempted to defeat as much of the enemy army as possible within the opening weeks of fighting. So the tactical level of fighting for an individual position, and then the operational level of attempting to defeat an enemy army. But arguably, Germany had never been very good, and this would go back to Prussia before it, at the kind of long-term strategic planning that the Allies were so skilled at in World War II. Arguably, this was because the Germans felt they had to win all their wars quickly or they would not win them at all, and that attempting to play strategic warfare with the vast economic and industrial resources of the United States was a losing game from the start.
Working closely with those on the ground, the Luftwaffe is wildly successful as the Second World War begins. Poland is easily demolished. Norway is taken away from the British effortlessly. The Low Countries and even the power of France cannot resist German might during the year 1940. It appears that nothing can stop Nazi forces from gobbling up the continent of Europe.
Certainly the Luftwaffe played an extremely important part in the opening German victories of World War II. And when we say opening victories, we don't mean the first 6 months, we mean the first 2 years, in which it looked like a German victory was very much in the offing. The German Air Force was very skilled at the tactical level, that is cooperation with the ground forces. It was extremely successful at the operational level of war, the intermediate level, that is carrying out campaigns against enemy supply lines, for example, feeding troops and men to the front.
With the fall of France, Britain is the only nation standing in the way of this German juggernaut. In order to finish off the rebellious island nation, a plan known as Operation Sea Lion is approved. It calls for the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority over the English Channel. Once this is completed, German forces will be deployed onto British soil. However, during this pivotal battle, the Luftwaffe is dealt its very first aerial defeat. Primarily through the use of Spitfires and Hurricanes, the English are able to push back German planes from the coast to Britannia. While this monumental struggle ensues, we discover one of the Luftwaffe's greatest failure, its lack of coordination with the Kriegsmarine.
Goering said, everything that flies is mine, and bitterly fought against any attempts by the German Navy to get a hold of a piece of the air action. When they wanted long-range aircraft assigned to them, actually Dönitz went behind Goering's back directly to Hitler, and I think got a dozen of the Focke-Wulf Condors assigned to him. Goering, when he found out about this, was furious and actually cut off all cooperation with the Kriegsmarine at this point.
Despite pleas by Admiral Raeder to create a separate air force for the Navy, Goering refuses to give the green light to any potential inter-service rivalry. The roots for this conflict come from each service's desire to be recognized as the one who brought victory to the fatherland.
Of course, there has always been the rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force from the point of view that we refer to ourselves as the Imperial Navy and refer to the Air Force as the Nazi Air Force. So that differentiated us already in attitude and character.
In hindsight, Goering's decision proves fatal as Germany and Britain battle it out in both the skies and on the high seas. Winston Churchill would write that the greatest threat to Britain was the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boat submarines are enormously successful in sinking English shipping.
I think Churchill was quite correct that the Battle of the Atlantic was the one front where Britain could really lose the war, because they were so dependent on supplies, even food, coming from North America, that if that lifeline was cut, Britain would have been really in dire straits.
With the defeat of France, bases are built right on their coast, giving these vessels an even bigger theatre to disrupt the lifeline of Britain. Had aerial forces worked closely with these U-boats, or if a separate naval aviation wing was created, it would be a game-changer in Germany's war against Britain. Proof of this can be seen in the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, an aircraft that, despite its limitations, is excellent in attacking English ships. With no more than a dozen planes, they successfully sink 85 merchant vessels and over 300,000 tons of shipping.
When the Germans started to deploy a fairly small number of the Focke-Wulf 200 Condors to attack Allied shipping, they were able to have really a devastating effect.
Also, had the new invention of a magnetic mine been dropped by Luftwaffe planes into the English Channel, its enemy could have been starved out of the war. This marks the first major failure of the Luftwaffe.
It was our common complaint of us, the little people, let's say, that there was no coordination whatsoever between the German Navy and the German Air Force.
With a stalemate on the Western Front, Germany decides to keep the British at bay and instead focus attention on their ally, the Soviet Union. Enacting a war plan known as Operation Barbarossa, some 3 million Nazi soldiers equipped with rifles, tanks and planes begin the biggest land assault in history. Using less than 3,000 aircraft, a force smaller than that utilized in the battle against France, Germany is miraculously able to push back Soviet forces to the suburbs of Moscow. The decision to launch Operation Barbarossa exposes the Luftwaffe to its second major failure, the lack of maintenance and repair on the ground. When a German aircraft is damaged, it is sent back to the fatherland for repair. When fighting a relatively short and tactical war against France, this particular system works fairly well. When fighting a long, drawn-out war of attrition against the communists, however, it proves to be a gigantic blunder. In the Soviet Union, with the fighting taking place far away from the major cities of Germany, the time it takes engineers to repair a damaged aircraft and have it sent back to the front is enormous. And by 1941, less than 30% of the Luftwaffe's airfields are operational, a fact that is almost inconceivable when taken into account that Germany is fighting a two-front struggle. As Field Marshal Erhard Milch would reflect after the war, the vertical organization in 4 territorial determined Luftflotte commands was grossly inadequate for launching a war well beyond the borders of the Third Reich. The attack of June 22, 1941 would in retrospect be a catastrophic mistake. For those like Goering, men who had never fought on the Eastern Front during the First World War, they would grossly underestimate the Soviet will and the industrial capacity of a regime thought to be so backwards by Hitler. Moving its factories far beyond the Ural Mountains, they are out of range of German bombers. The ghost of General Wefer comes back to haunt the Luftwaffe. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany declares war against the United States. Before this decision is made, Hitler shrugs off any suggestion of a possible American threat in the form of an arsenal of democracy. In declaring war, Hitler foolishly adds yet another enemy to the Third Reich's list, one with a production capacity that is unparalleled. With two oceans separating America from the fighting, its people can go on producing without the threat of bombardment. Britain would have hauled the flag down long ago if it had not been for America's support, one field marshal said. With Germany by this time experiencing severe shortage of aluminium and copper, America is fully stocked of these and other vital raw materials. By 1944, the United States is able to churn out over 96,000 planes per year, one every 5 minutes, more than double that of the Germans. Before this catastrophic decision is made, it is important to note that by 1940, even Britain, with its shipping being torpedoed at an unprecedented rate, is outproducing Germany in aircraft. The British are able to improvise, and as a result produce outstanding planes like the de Havilland Mosquito, an aircraft made from plywood. In contrast, by 1941, with Nazi forces engaged in a two-front war, total production is just over 11,000 planes, a yearly increase of only 3,000 from when the war began. It is clear that the Third Reich's total output is only a fraction of what it could be.
One of the failures of the German Luftwaffe was their inability ever to work out a sane procurement and production process. Prototypes would be built and abandoned. They would be rebuilt and altered by Hitler's order and abandoned, and rebuilt a third time and perhaps put into production as an aircraft very, very different from what the original designers had intended.
This lack of planning and foresight can be attributed to the man who took control of Luftwaffe production in 1936, long before the war began. His name is Ernst Udet. An outstanding ace from the First World War, he is put in control by Goering, replacing Wilhelm Wimmer. His appointment to this powerful position marks the third, and possibly the greatest failure of the Luftwaffe.
Goering placed one of his World War I fighter ace buddies, Ernst Udet, in charge of technical developments. Udet really didn't know anything about this stuff.
Second-generation aircraft during the pre-war era, including the Me-109, the Junkers 87, and the Heinkel 111. With Udet as his replacement, however, the next line of aircraft is a far cry from their predecessors.
One of his hobby horses was dive bombers. He had seen, actually, in America, interestingly, between the wars, a demonstration of dive bombing, thought every German bomber should be made into a dive bomber, and then even ordered this new four-engine bomber, Heinkel 177, under development, to be made into a dive bomber. Well, Heinkel himself, who was, after all, an engineer who understood this, kept trying to talk him out of it, said this is ridiculous, but was overruled, and so they had to go back and strengthen the wings of the 177 to try to reduce drag so it could actually dive at high speeds. They tried mounting the engines in pairs instead of having four engines like you would normally think you would do on a bomber. They were mounted front and back in a single pod on each wing. This resulted in so much heat being generated that the engines were constantly overheating. So it really, I mean, it was a crazy idea, and it led directly to delays, and I guess you can really say the ultimate failure of Germany to field an effective four-engine bomber during the war.
The Heinkel 177, with its odd tandem engine arrangement and an insane requirement by Udet to dive bomb, makes this plane a complete disaster from start to finish. The aircraft becomes known as the Dead Racehorse, with only a handful ever getting the chance to fly.
The Heinkel 177 and the Me-210
go hand in hand as one of the Luftwaffe's major disasters.
The Messerschmitt 210, a replacement for the ME 110, is full of problems that are never ratified.
When he came up with his Messerschmitt 210, the RLF said, oh yes, that's very good, let's immediately, we'll order 10,000. Or whatever it was, but they went into mass production and the thing had hardly flown. It was a complete and utter disaster for Messerschmitt, which he'd never lived down, and they had to convert a lot of the built ME-210s into ME-410s by taking the aeroplanes to pieces again and reassembling them with new parts to turn it into a flyable and operational machine.
As one aircraft representative is overheard saying, everything turns to dust in Udet's hands. Only one aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190, is considered a success under his watch. A reluctance to make the hard decisions also proves costly, as resources are diverted to projects that are simply unfeasible during wartime. By 1941, the need is for long-range strategic bombers, with America producing the B-17 Flying Fortress and the British reworking the Avro Manchester into the four-engine Avro Lancaster. Germany, in contrast, falls dramatically behind the Allies in producing four-engine bombers. Udet, with all his failures, commits suicide in 1941, leaving the Luftwaffe in shambles. With a Soviet victory at Stalingrad, German forces are pushed back, marking the beginning of the end. And as American and British bombers begin destroying German factories and city centers from the sky, the philosophy that General Weber endorsed years ago is coming true. Strategic bombing is proving vital in weakening the German war machine. Under the command of Field Marshal Erhard Milch, production is able to climb to 25,000 planes a year, a respectable increase, but nothing compared to what the Allies are able to produce.
U.S. procurement policies, which become a giant bureaucracy, embodied in the War Department and soon thereafter, World War II, embodied in the Pentagon. The Germans were simply not able to compete on that level.
In 1944, Germany is being outmaneuvered in the realm of aircraft by the rate of over 4 to 1. At this point, there is simply no way to compete with the United States or the Soviet Union. While much is written by historians about Allied coordination in resources and materials, little can be found about Germany's willingness to use its own allies' means of production to their advantage. This is yet another failure of the German Luftwaffe. Without a common goal and being on different sides of the world, the Empire of Japan cannot be considered Germany's biggest ally. Its most powerful friend during the war is instead the Italians. Unfortunately, with their own air force in shambles, the Nazis are reluctant to give them the licenses and the engines to build German planes on Italian soil. This proves to be a pivotal mistake, as Italy could have tripled aircraft production with German assistance, producing possibly 30,000 planes during the war. Also, Italian factories would have been out of bombing range for the Allies during the year 1942 and might have changed the outcome in the Mediterranean. Germany's other allies, Romania, Hungary and Finland, are all capable of making aircraft, but lack the knowledge and resources that the fatherland can provide. Had these nations been granted licenses to build Nazi aircraft on their own soil, there was a good chance that this coalition might have tipped the scale in favor of Germany during its pivotal battle against the Soviets during 1941. The decision not to fully utilize the resources of these nations can be attributed to Germany's desire to be the dominant power. There is widespread resentment against the Italians by top Nazi leaders who see them as merely riding off the coattails of German success.
Our feeling always was, with the experience of the First World War already, we wish the Italians were on the other side.
People like Hermann Goering see these smaller countries as the providers of natural resources, with the fatherland supplying the finished products. This marks another tragic failure of the Luftwaffe. In early 1944, Germany unveils the Messerschmitt 262, a revolutionary jet plane that can hopefully take down the flying fortresses and mosquitoes that are destroying their cities.
Later on, of course, they produced the world's first production model, general use jet aircraft in the form of the Messerschmitt 262, the Me-262. The Me-262 as a pure fighter was an amazing sight to see, and in fact, anyone looking at it today is still struck by the modern and sleek lines.
Now, the Me-262 was, in my opinion, I've stated this many times, the most formidable aircraft of World War II.
The Me-262 is years ahead of its time, symbolizing the fatherland's creativity and innovation. In many ways, however, the Me-262 also symbolizes Nazi indecision.
Unfortunately, the Me-262 got caught in a very, very arcane and difficult procurement process within Germany, wherein basic designs were put forward by competent engineers. They were then changed by upper echelons within the Luftwaffe, and of course they had to pass the Hitler test. And no aircraft passed the Hitler test without being significantly modified. The Me-262 is no exception.
After Professor Messerschmitt tells Hitler that the aircraft can carry up to 1,000 kilograms of bombs, Field Marshal Milch, in a fit of rage, tells the Führer that even the smallest infant can see that the 262 is a fighter, not a bomber. After months of wavering, the plane goes ahead as a fighter-bomber, taking the sting out of what could have been a ferocious punch. They may possess this wonder weapon, but have few men that can fly it. This becomes the Luftwaffe's final failure, its pilots' lack of training. During its heyday, Germany's finest were given approximately 250 hours of flight time before being sent out to face their enemy, considerably more than the British. And with the Second World War going exceedingly well during 1940 and 1941, the Luftwaffe arrogantly minimizes its training program, figuring that the war will soon be over. By 1942, as the tide begins turning, German pilots are given less than 200 hours of practice flying, while Allied pilots are given over 300. With the war turning against them, shortcuts are made to churn out every single pilot possible. Despite this augmentation, by 1944 the average training time drops to just under 100 hours. In some cases, just a quarter of what P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt pilots were given. With air superiority lost over German soil, it becomes a turkey shoot for American and British aviators as they begin gunning down Me-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s with ease.
At D-Day, in the final planning, the head of Allied Tactical Aviation was asked, well, what are we going to do about the German fighters? He said there aren't going to be any German fighters over the landing beaches. And he was essentially right, because they'd been wiped out by then.
The decision not to build a pilot training infrastructure like its enemies causes the Luftwaffe to run desperately short on experienced men. So by the time planes like the Me-262, the Arado 234 jet bomber, the Me-163, a rocket-powered interceptor, the Dornier 335 Arrow, the fastest piston-engine plane of the Second World War, and all the other revolutionary aircraft that could have been the difference-maker on both fronts, it is a case of too little, too late. The defeat of the Luftwaffe can be attributed to its lack of direction. With the war going in Germany's favor, Hitler, Goering, and Udet were blinded by a false optimism. The tactical war doctrine that they favored initially was being replaced by a long, drawn-out strategic war that they were ill-prepared for. The arrogant nature in which they brushed off the industrial power of the United States and the Soviet Union. The mismanagement of their own country's aircraft industry on a grand scale, and the lack of infrastructure, production, and training during the Second World War's most decisive years would cause the Luftwaffe to write its own epitaph.
It is the aftermath of the war to end all wars, and Europe begins to pick up the pieces. While many Germans find the limits imposed on them under the Treaty of Versailles restrictive, a loophole leaves them free to experiment with rocket power, not yet considered an instrument of modern war. The VFR, a spaceflight society founded in Breslau, Germany, gathers together many rocketry enthusiasts. From just 3 members at their first meeting, the society flourishes, attracting hundreds of amateur rocketeers. And in 1933, one of these amateurs has some ideas that catch the eye of the newly elected Nazis. His name is Wernher von Braun. Working under a military grant, von Braun proposes to use liquid propulsion to power rocket flight, and goes on to create the V-2 rocket. He also comes up with plans for a series of manned vertical takeoff interceptors. This exotic weapon would launch high into the air and swoop down on incoming bombers. But the German Air Ministry, unimpressed with the power of the proposed craft, cancel it in the planning stages. (1941). Hitler's plan for an 11-month war has stretched into 2 years. The German Air Ministry has a new rocket-powered interceptor in development, one slightly more conventional than previous efforts. The Messerschmitt 163, the Comet.
If you want a brief description of it, it's like flying a runaway train.
Before design plans are even complete, General Oberst Ernst Udet orders 70 of these wonder planes into production.
You could describe the Comet as a manned surface-to-air missile. It was not designed to fly long distances. It was designed to take off, climb very fast, shoot down bombers, come back down as fast as possible, land as safely as possible, which could be a neat trick, be refueled, reloaded, and then go up again. That was a theory. In practice, it proved rather more complicated than that.
From the mind of Alexander Martin Lippisch, the Comet is a swept-wing design, but with a novel twist. There's no tail wing. Formerly the director of a glider research group, Lippisch understands the need to reduce total drag on a fast-moving aircraft. This he achieves through his tailless design. As he explains, birds have tails because birds fly slowly, but the Comet is meant to fly fast.
The original designer of that family of aircraft, the flying wings, sort of the tailless aircraft, was Alexander Lippisch. I won't try to pronounce it, but Alexander Lippisch, great aerodynamicist, extremely brilliant gentleman, had done some work before the war on tailless aircraft. He was asked to develop something of a more military nature.
Production of the prototype begins in 1941, under great secrecy. And when it's finally fitted with its Walters engine and ready for its first flight, the pilot risking his life in the cockpit is a man named Heini Dittmar. On October the 2nd, 1941, the Comet prototype is towed into the air by a Messerschmitt 110 and rises to an altitude of 13,500 feet. Once there, Dittmar releases himself from the 110, turns on the rocket engine, and roars forward, nearly breaking the speed of sound, and finally flying faster than 1,000 kilometers per hour.
It's so rapid, things happen so fast, that it's the only time I've ever been in an airplane I felt was a jump ahead of me.
The Comet prototype is a success, and plans for a fully operational version are given the highest priority. But as the war begins to turn against Germany, it remains uncertain whether the Comet can become operational in time. For Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain, has failed, and Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, is failing. Need for a wonder weapon is stronger than ever, but development of the Comet Interceptor progresses far too slowly. And while the improved version, built to accommodate a larger engine and increased armament, is assembled and ready, its Walter's engine is not. Delayed in part by mechanical errors and in part by lack of support for defensive weapons, it's not until the summer of 1943 that the engine is finally delivered. But now there are new concerns. Although an extremely reliable engine, this reliability comes at a cost. For the engine is powered by two very volatile fuels. 3 parts C-Stoff, a powerful reductant, to 1 part T-Stoff, a deadly peroxide. When mixed, these fuels react instantly and violently, thus creating a powerful rocket propellant, but a dangerous working situation.
What the Germans used was approximately 95% pure peroxide. That thing, when you put it on your skin, didn't make bubbles. It ate you, literally, ate you alive. It had this extremely corrosive effect on human flesh, any flesh, which explains why the pilots and the ground crews had to wear special clothing. You had the equipment, the nozzles, the buckets, everything had to be used and segregated completely.
Fueling, cleaning and refueling of the Messerschmitt Comet is a complicated and dangerous affair. To make room for both fuel tanks in the fuselage, the plane is equipped with jettisonable wheels. Every part of the engine, fuel lines and fuel tanks must be meticulously flushed out after every use. For if even one drop of T-Stoff mixes with C-Stoff outside the engine crucible, the entire plane will explode. But finally, on June the 24th, 1943, the improved version of the Messerschmitt Comet is ready for its maiden flight. The plane is towed out to the runway, and the pilot climbs in. He makes his adjustments and prepares for takeoff. The plane starts traveling at 200 miles per hour down the runway. It jettisons its wheels, pulls up 80 degrees, and rapidly climbs to an altitude of 40,000 feet in an unheard of 3 minutes. When the plane levels off, it quickly accelerates to speeds approaching 900 kilometers per hour, faster than any Allied plane could hope to match.
It had a very, very fast dive, even with no power. And of course, it was entirely a clear weather machine, because when you ran your fuel out, you had to glide back to your airfield. The only thing was, when you got to your airfield, you had to make sure that you had no fuel at all aboard, because they were very explosive fuels, and even a hard landing and some fuel aboard would cause the whole aircraft to disintegrate.
It is more maneuverable around all 3 axes than any known airplane, and nearly 200 are produced for active service. Combat operations begin in 1944, and as expected, Allied fighters are at a complete loss as to how to react. A red version of the plane is produced, recalling aviation legend Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, although not all pilots are happy with this ominous reminder. But still, there are more problems. Because the cockpit is not pressurized, pilots suffer gastrointestinal problems and must be fed special low-fiber diets. Also, the Walter's engine is prone to cutting out during flight, and while the Comet is a highly efficient glider by necessity, it can become difficult to control at top speeds. As such, only very experienced combat pilots are capable of making any enemy kills. And once Allied fighters take note of the Comet's short-powered flight, they wait the plane out, pouncing on it after its engine shuts off. Finally, the superior gliding capability of the swept-wing design proves detrimental to safe landing, causing the aircraft to suddenly rise back into the air with even the slightest updraft. In short, more planes are lost to landing accidents than result in enemy kills.
Messerschmitt and the Luftwaffe certainly knew that the Comet had limitations. An improved version with a pressurized cockpit was developed, for example, the 263, which was, I believe, turned over to Junkers. So it became the Junkers 263. At a very sort of egg-like appearance, landing gear could retract, but very narrow track, different engine.
In this design, the fuselage is stretched to accommodate larger fuel tanks for longer range. The new engine is to be equipped with 2 chambers, one to provide power for takeoff and climbing, and the second to provide adjustable cruising power. The aircraft is designed to reach an altitude of 40,000 feet and to still have 100 minutes of fuel left for combat. And it's hoped the new retractable landing gear will prevent any further costly landing accidents. Also, the pressurized cockpit, intended to eliminate pilot health concerns, is to be fitted with a bubble canopy to improve the pilot's rear view. Had this plane become operational, it would certainly have been capable of far more combat kills than its predecessor. But by 1945, progress on the project is so slow that it's only reached the prototype stage. And when the Junkers factory is later overrun by Soviet troops, the one and only completed aircraft is taken back to the Soviet Union.
As a viable combat aircraft, its success was mixed. Given the resources that were poured into it, keeping in mind that Germany, 1943-44 resources were at a premium, you didn't have like money and stuff to throw away, one could argue they might have been better off using something else, like manufacturing other types of aircraft, piston-powered aircraft, fighters, for example. The Comet was pretty much a one-off machine. As an idea, yes, it's a gadget.
And at this point in the war, more fighter aircraft might have indeed made a difference. Now Germany is under direct attack. Air raids by the British Royal Air Force are the heaviest assault to date in the history of aviation warfare. The result of this persistent and merciless bombing is devastating. Huge firestorms are created, killing thousands. Those who don't burn to death in the streets suffocate in their shelters and basements. Germany needs a wonder weapon. But despite its innovation and high speeds, the Comet 163 is not the weapon to turn the tide of war. Since the Comet has not lived up to expectations, Germany looks for new avenues to ward off bomber attacks. On June the 6th, 1944, the Allies land at Normandy, and step by step, the German defensive lines are pushed back. Soon the British cross the Seine and finally break through the German front, taking Brussels and then Aachen by September of that year. Meanwhile, in the skies, American B-17s wreak havoc on the German mainland. After Hamburg, there's Berlin, and then there's Dresden. Germany is being brought to its knees.
Well, the Germans had this problem. They were attacked on the ground by huge forces of tanks, especially on the Eastern Front. You need powerful weapons. They were also attacked by bombers, daytime, nighttime. So they had to develop very powerful weapons for all these enemies.
And in the southwest of Germany, near the small town of Waldsee, Erich Bochum believes he is designing just such a weapon. The Bochum BA-349 Natter.
The Natter for me is utterly fascinating. It was, for not many people really appreciate it, was the very first vertical takeoff aircraft designed for its role.
Co-founding Bochum Werks in 1941, in 1944, Erich Bochum bases much of the Natter design on Werner von Braun's rejected 1939 proposal, a proposal Bochum discovered while working at the Pfeil Aircraft Company. Here, a series of Jordanov cutaway diagrams show the simple design of the Natter, beginning with the fuselage and subsequently showing the control column, the Walters engine, the fuel tank cradle, the fuel tank, and finally the pilot's seat and cockpit. But in spite of its simplicity, it's an uphill battle for Bochum to obtain the support necessary to complete this project.
Initially, he took the idea to the German air ace Adolf Galland. Galland at the time was the general of the fighter air arm. Galland was watching his fighter force being decimated. He was interested in any radical idea that might reverse this trend, so he could see the potential in the Natter.
Unfortunately, however, Galland's hands are tied. While the German Air Ministry initially agreed to 150 planes, by late 1944 they cancelled the project in favour of designs further along in production. So, seeing no other choice for Bochum, Galland sends him to make a deal with the devil. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS.
Bochum was granted an audience, and it was clear that Himmler wanted to take the Natter under his control. At this stage, Himmler's power was in the ascendancy.
Himmler's power may be in the ascendancy, but it's not yet unchecked. Earlier that year, he had had Werner von Braun arrested, only to have Hitler release him 1 month later. So now, Himmler operates with some caution. But ultimately, the SS agreed to take control of the Natter project, and immediately reorder the 150 planes the Air Ministry cancelled. In response, the Air Ministry reverse their earlier decision and order 50 more for themselves. So finally, construction begins on what is quite possibly the most radical design of World War II. The fuselage is mostly a series of wooden frames covered with plywood sheeting and held together by screws and glue. Only the cockpit, itself contained within a wooden frame, is made of armour for the pilot's protection. The wings are rectangular wooden slabs without flaps or control devices, and the cruciform tail consists of 4 fins and 4 control surfaces. Interestingly enough, the Walters engine used to power it is the same liquid propellant engine used in the Messerschmitt Comet, requiring both C-Stoff and T-Stoff for fuel. However, as additional takeoff thrust is needed, a much older technology is also used. 4 solid fuel rockets, using the same black powder that had been experimented with decades earlier by enthusiastic German rocketeers, are bolted to the aft fuselage. It truly is a radical design.
The Natter was something completely different. You fired it off like a missile, vertically from a ramp, so it was even closer to the idea of a manned missile than the Comet was.
Because the Natter requires no runway, it can be built and launched from almost anywhere. And as both the plane and the pilot are meant to parachute to the ground, not land after flight, there are written instructions on the fuselage on who to call for retrieval. Also, as the Natter's accelerated rate of climb will cause the pilot to temporarily black out on liftoff, it's initially guided by ground radio control. Radically brilliant in its combination of old and new technology, the Natter nevertheless remains a dangerous experiment. And now it's time for a manned test. But who would agree to such a potentially suicidal mission? It's January 1945. The war is going very badly, and the SS, now in complete control of the Natter project, are demanding a manned launch. They begin the search for a qualified pilot, but a pilot of a very particular kind. The kind who might be convinced to accept a mission that could go disastrously wrong. The answer to their prayers is 22-year-old Lothar Sieber. A remarkably experienced pilot, he had worked for the secret KB-200 unit, flying captured Allied bombers, including American B-17s. But 2 years earlier, Sieber had lost his rank of Oberleutnant after being court-martialed on an alcohol-related charge. Demoted to a mere Gefreiter, or private first class, Now his only hope of regaining his former rank is the Natter. But there is one snag: Gertrud Nardit, his fiancée. The two are engaged to be married, and the question remains, will Sieber risk his life and the future happiness of the woman he loves just for the rank of Oberleutnant?
They must have been quite deeply in love, because when, prior to Sieber taking off in the Natter, he wrote a will the day before, and it's a very touching document in which he says that he leaves all his worldly goods to his fiancée, and as well as that, he said that he would be happy if she would take his name, even though they weren't married, if he should pass on.
So, on the same night he writes his last will and testament, he takes his wife-to-be to the launch site and tells her of his dream. On March the 1st, 1945, Lothar Sieber is the first pilot of the Luftwaffe, the first of the world, to man a vertical takeoff interceptor. The flight lasts 55 seconds and reaches 1,600 feet. But when the canopy is released, Sieber fails to eject himself, and he goes down with the crashing plane. The Balchem Natter's first pilot is dead. The test, a calamity. Nevertheless, in the month that follows, 3 more unmanned test launches are conducted. Shortly after that, the plane is put into operation, with a battery of 10 at Kirchheim, near Stuttgart. So it is, in April 1945, that pilots stand alert, ready at a moment's notice to launch the Natters and engage approaching enemy fighters. But the fighters don't come. The pilots are looking in the wrong direction. For the Allies no longer attack from the sky, but from the ground. On April the 20th, 1945, the US 10th Armored Division drives its tanks and troops into Kirchheim, and the next day crosses the A21 Autobahn into the Natter launch site. Fierce fighting ensues, but there are no Natter planes left for the Allies to capture. Under SS orders, they have all been destroyed. The first manned vertical takeoff interceptor never sees even one day of action. While the mere idea of a wooden supersonic plane is completely unheard of outside the chaos of the Nazi regime, had the Natter fought in battle, it certainly would have caused some damage to the Allied bombing force. For, as unpractical and dangerous as it is, the Natter could still reach a height of 30,000 feet in a matter of minutes, and would be prepared to fight the enemy with a salvo of high-powered rockets.
Having no cannon, the Natter was fitted with rockets, unguided rockets, 55mm Orkans. They would be aimed visually at the pilot. Once he got close enough, he fired them at the bomber. Hopefully 1 or 2 would hit the aircraft. And once that was done, being unarmed, the pilot would sort of break up the aircraft. That's how it worked. It would pull a lever, the canopy, the cockpit section would go one way, the rear of the aircraft would go another way. Both sections would come down, hopefully in one piece, to be reused.
The end would come down by its own parachute, the front part of the fuselage would come down by its other parachute, and at a certain safe height, the pilot could actually just get out and come down by his normal parachute.
The catch is, it was another gadget. If the Comet was a bit of a risky gadget, the Natter was a very risky gadget.
Shortly after Germany's defeat, a complete but broken up Natter airframe is discovered at the German Research Institute for Gliders near Salzburg. Later, 3 more operational units are discovered in a meadow near St. Leonhard in Austria, and at least one of these units is quickly evacuated to the United States for further study. But there, the plane is scorned and scoffed at.
The Natter was not a good idea, was not a good airplane. It was completely impractical. It was damn dangerous. What were they thinking of? I mean, this question of desperation again was in the air. The Germans had all these bright ideas, so they thought. They were completely unfocused. They had all these ideas, but they went nowhere.
The last few months of the war, the Allies had such overwhelming firepower, control of the air. Whatever the Germans would have had, other than the atom bomb, wouldn't have had any effect at all.
But is it really so easy to dismiss German ingenuity? While in practice these wonder weapons certainly did not work as planned, ultimately they do lead to some very important later developments.
The Natter for me is really the precursor in concept terms to the space shuttle. You can send something up, you can get it to do its job, and then it all comes down again and you can reuse it.
For all their differences, both the Bochum Natter and the Space Shuttle have similarities. Both are monoplanes. Both take off vertically, use liquid propulsion and solid booster rockets, and both are initially guided by autopilot. But then these similarities shouldn't really be all that surprising. For who is the man considered the father of the United States space program but Wernher von Braun? The very same man whose original vertical takeoff proposal inspired Erich Bochum to build the Natter, thus cementing the legacy of Hitler's rocket men.
It was such a wonderful machine to fly because it turned, slipped, side slip, do all of the things that you had to do in combat so easily.
I'm very proud of the fact that I was involved in the design and the development of the aircraft.
It is the most beautiful aircraft I have ever flown in my life, and it was a fighter.
The Supermarine Spitfire, a powerful symbol of defiance and victory during the Battle of Britain. Fast, agile, and beautifully sleek, the Spitfire represented the cutting edge of RAF fighter command in its legendary fight against Hitler's Luftwaffe. With over 23,000 Spitfires produced, it was the only Allied fighter to stay in production throughout the entire war. The aircraft's design was so advanced that development continued through 24 marked numbers, most of which entered actual production. Few Spitfire variants were unsuccessful, a rare achievement in fighter development history. Supermarine and Rolls-Royce collaborated so closely that only two engine types, the Rolls-Royce Merlin and Griffin, powered the Spitfire. The diversity of roles the Spitfire performed during World War II exceeded all expectations. It served as a fast interceptor, high and low altitude reconnaissance plane, and tactical fighter bomber, proving the brilliance of its original design. Yet, the Spitfire's inception was risky. While the Hawker Hurricane reflected traditional aircraft construction, the Spitfire was a revolutionary design, born from the genius of one of aviation's greatest designers. Reginald Mitchell, chief designer at Supermarine, gained fame by creating high-performance seaplanes that won the Schneider Speed Trials for Britain 3 times between 1929 and 1931.
Mitchell was a brilliant designer. He was a very, very good leader. He was an easy man to get on with. He did have his occasional flare-ups, but one of his main advantages was that he was able to pick the right people to do the job.
Soon after, Mitchell's S6B Racer, the fastest of his designs, set a world record by reaching 407 miles per hour.
As a man, I liked him enormously and respected him because he was tremendously...
Later known as the Gloucester Gladiator. The Ministry's choice of a biplane was a significant in high-speed monoplanes. During a convalescence trip to Germany in 1933, after a major operation, Mitchell realized the urgent need for an advanced British fighter. With Adolf Hitler in power and the Nazi Party controlling Germany, the threat of rearmament loomed large. Mitchell believed that if Germany rearmed, it would heavily prioritize aircraft. Germany, perhaps more than any other nation, had become fascinated with aviation. The Graf Zeppelin had flown around the world, while the massive 12-engine Dornier Do X crossed both the North and South Atlantic. German aviators were celebrated as symbols of a national revival. The number of trained German airmen was increasing rapidly. 50,000 young Germans were members of gliding clubs, and Lufthansa, the state airline, was heavily subsidized. Its domestic services alone surpassed the global operations of all British and French airlines combined. Mitchell concluded that German rearmament would produce the most formidable air force in Europe. Conversations with young German aviators convinced him that Adolf Hitler would inevitably lead the country to war. For Mitchell, this realization sparked a relentless ounce of Mitchell's energy was now dedicated to creating a new fighter aircraft. He based his design around a highly promising engine being developed by Rolls-Royce. Derived from the R-series engines of the Schneider racers, the 1,025 horsepower PV-12, later renamed the Merlin, was central to Mitchell's plan.
He started to design an aircraft to his own ideas, which had 8 guns firing forward. It had an enclosed cockpit, retractable undercarriage, and all of the produced something with a very high speed. He had also introduced the on its own, and then putting plating on it. The plating, the external plating, actually took some of the stress as well. And that lesson was carried on into the design of what became the Spitfire.
His prototype fighter K5054 was completed well before Rolls-Royce resolved several cooling system issues. However, on March 5, 1936, K5054 made its maiden flight.
Recruiting office and said I wanted to be a pilot. And he said, well, you can't volunteer to be a pilot. You might become a pilot. So I said, all right, I'll volunteer for aircrew. So he said, right, well, what's your name and address and what did your father do and what's your job? So I said, well, I work at Supermarine. So he said, what do you do at Supermarine? I said, well, I'm an apprentice. Apprentice, he said. He looked me in the eye and he picked up the piece of paper and he just tore it in half and he said, you go back to work, my son. He said, you're doing a better job there.
Since 1934, the British Air Ministry had been alarmed by intelligence reports indicating Germany was secretly building an air force with a planned strength of 4,000 aircraft. Mitchell's concerns were now fully validated. In response to the growing threat, the RAF initiated leaders emerged who believed that, with enough fighters, the German threat, particularly from its fast monoplane bombers, could be neutralized. One such figure was Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, newly appointed as Air Member for Supply and Research, Mitchell's Spitfire. One of the key requirements of the new specification which would make Britain's next generation of fighters formidable, was that the aircraft be equipped with 8 wing-mounted machine guns. Initially, the Spitfire's stressed metal wing design posed significant manufacturing challenges. The complex techniques and specialized tools needed led to delays, but the end result was more than worth the effort. The curved wing shape maximized surface area for its span and provided exceptional strength where the wing root connected to the fuselage. This design gave the Spitfire its incredible ability to make tight turns without the risk of structural failure. In fact, it could handle combat loadings of up to 9G. Mitchell's innovative wing design also greatly enhanced the Spitfire's speed. Despite accommodating 4 machine guns, the wing was extraordinarily thin speed dives. Pilots who first flew the new aircraft were amazed by its performance, exceeding 300 miles per hour, and by how easily it could be flown, even by newcomers to the plane. Its stall characteristics in particular were forgiving, a crucial advantage in aerial combat. The test pilots were so impressed by the Spitfire prototype that even before its 7-day trial ended, and without a formal report, the Air Ministry placed an order for 310 aircraft. The first production Spitfire, K9787, took to the skies on May 14, 1938. Sadly, Reginald Mitchell did not live to witness Britain's confidence in his creation. In poor health and weakened by his efforts, Mitchell died of tuberculosis in June 1937 at the age of 42.
Mitchell's death, and I remember, in fact, the day that he died, Black and I were working in the laboratory on something, I don't know what now. We both sort of stopped what we were doing, looked at one another, silenced for a bit, and then got on with the job.
In August 1938, the first production Spitfires were delivered to the RAF's 19th Squadron at Duxford for evaluation. These early models were powered by the Merlin II engine and featured a 2-bladed fixed-pitch wooden propeller. They could reach 352 miles per hour at 19,000 feet and had a maximum climb rate of 2,420 feet per minute and could ascend to 20,000 feet in 9.4 minutes. Despite this impressive performance, it did not yet fully harness the Merlin engine's potential. After the 78th Spitfire rolled off the production line, the de Havilland Hamilton 2-pitch, 3-bladed metal propeller became standard, optimized for both takeoff and cruising. The Spitfire's takeoff distance was significantly reduced, but an engine could truly deliver its best performance. To accommodate the constant speed propeller from the 175th Spitfire onwards, a modified engine, the Merlin III, was installed. In 1938, despite the boost of British rearmament following the Munich crisis, Spitfire production remained disappointingly low. Only 3 squadrons were equipped with the new fighter that year. Even with larger numbers of the slower but easier to produce Hurricane, Britain had only a fraction of the fighter force needed for sufficient home defense. That minimum fighter force was based on the assumption that Fighter Command would need to maintain continuous standing patrols during any conflict. However, standing patrols might not be necessary. Although still in its infancy, radar promised to revolutionize air defense. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, now head of Fighter Command, played a pivotal role in establishing Britain's radar defense network. The backbone of Dowding's system was a series of radar stations known as Chain Home, capable of detecting enemy aircraft approaching the British coast from 40 miles away. However, exercises revealed that Chain Home could not detect low-flying aircraft. To address this, a second network called Chain Home Low was established, capable of detecting aircraft flying just above sea level from a distance of 30 miles. Together, these networks formed the world's first air defense radar system. Dowding's challenge was converting radar detections into actionable intelligence for directing Spitfires and Hurricanes. To solve this, he created filter centers tasked with distinguishing friendly aircraft from enemy ones. By taking cross bearings from two nearby stations, they can estimate the course of incoming intruders. Radar operators and plotters, often members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, became highly skilled at estimating target ranges, bearings, altitudes, and even numbers. Interceptions were controlled from plotting rooms at sector, group, and fighter command levels. Since the radar defense network couldn't track enemy aircraft once they crossed the British coast and moved inland, tens of thousands of observers were trained to report sightings of enemy aircraft in their sectors. This information was then relayed to Observer Corps headquarters at the appropriate filter center. Dowding's aim in designing such a complex detection and plotting system was to maximize the chances that every Spitfire and Hurricane sent into the air would intercept the enemy. All flights would be directly combat-related. His defensive network was completed just in time. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's armies invaded Poland. As the Luftwaffe struck the Polish Air Force, destroying most of its fighters on the ground, and German bombers crippled Polish communications, it became evident that this was a new kind of warfare. Blitzkrieg tactics, where fast-moving armored units coordinated with a powerful air force, were a terrifying revelation. Over 700 miles from the battlefront, Britain could do nothing to aid its Polish allies. France, with the most powerful army in Europe and a shared border with Germany, was in a better position but failed to act decisively. Within weeks, Poland's defeat was inevitable. On November 18, 1939, 6 weeks after Poland's fall, the Supermarine Spitfire made its first mission over German territory. Ironically, this mission was in a role for which the Spitfire was never originally designed, but one in which it excelled: high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance. Stripped of guns and ammunition, the RAF's reconnaissance Spitfires could soar to 35,000 feet, well beyond the reach of German flak, and fly faster than any enemy fighter. they swiftly transformed British photographic intelligence operations. By the end of 1939, in just 15 sorties, 2 Spitfires had covered 5,000 square miles of enemy territory without any losses. This marked the beginning of the Spitfire's distinguished career as one of the war's finest photographic reconnaissance aircraft. On May 10, 1940, the storm of Blitzkrieg struck France and the Low Countries. The offensive commenced with over 300 German bombers attacking 22 Allied airfields in northern France, Belgium, and Holland. The Belgian and Dutch air forces were obliterated on the ground, while the French faced significant damage. The next day, it was the RAF's airfields in France that came under attack. Despite facing relentless air assaults, the Hawker Hurricanes of the British Expeditionary Forces Air Component fought valiantly against overwhelming odds. The effect of the Hurricanes in slowing the Luftwaffe offensive was disproportionate to their numbers. However, with 1,000 Allied aircraft destroyed in just 2 days and the French Air Force retreating to relative safety in the interior, defeat seemed inevitable. After the dramatic breakthrough by German armor at Sedan, which bypassed the defenses of the Maginot Line, the ground war was effectively lost. The French government implored for additional British fighters, but Sir Hugh Dowding, aware that any further losses would render Britain's future defense a hopeless endeavor, stubbornly resisted. Events quickly proved Dowding's judgment correct. By May 20th, France had been divided in two by a powerful German armored thrust. The British Expeditionary Force, along with the bulk of the French 1st and 7th Armies, found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket around Dunkirk. The last RAF airfield in Belgium had already been abandoned. As German armor closed in on Dunkirk, the fate of 300,000 Allied soldiers seemed almost sealed. Yet, on May 24th, Hitler ordered his panzers to halt. Hermann Göring, chief of the Luftwaffe, buoyed by his victories, had assured Hitler that the German Air Force could, unaided, eliminate the remnants of the expeditionary force at Dunkirk. For the destruction of the Allied stronghold, the Luftwaffe assembled 300 bombers and 500 fighters, most of which were the formidable Messerschmitt 109E. The 109E was equipped with 2 fuselage-mounted MG-17 machine guns, each carrying 1,000 rounds, and 2 wing-mounted cannons, each with 60 rounds. Powered by the Daimler-Benz 601A engine, the 109E offered a very short takeoff and excellent climb capability. Its performance at altitudes of 20,000 feet and higher was considerably better. Since the outbreak of the war, the Messerschmitt 109 had dominated the skies over Europe. Pilots of the 109 were convinced that wherever the aircraft engaged in combat, victory was assured. It was with this high confidence that the Luftwaffe set out to destroy the Allies at Dunkirk. What the German airmen had not foreseen was that, over the Dunkirk beaches, the Luftwaffe would encounter significant numbers of RAF Spitfires for the first time. Throughout Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk, 16 squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes flew at a time to disrupt the German attacks on the port area and the evacuation fleet. In total, 32 RAF squadrons participated in the Dunkirk operation. Despite being able to spend only 15 minutes over the battle zone at combat aircraft capable of meeting the Messerschmitt 109 on equal terms, it quickly became clear that the Spitfire's ability to outturn the 109 provided a crucial advantage in close combat. Additionally, the Messerschmitt's cannon did not prove to be the devastating weapon that the Luftwaffe had anticipated. Its low muzzle velocity and slow rate of fire often meant that a pass would result in very few rounds actually striking a fast-moving Spitfire. On the British side, the Spitfire pilots discovered that if their guns were harmonized to converge at 200 yards instead of the official 650 yards, their hitting power was more than sufficient to destroy a 109 in a single pass. In one significant regard, the Spitfire was incomparably superior to its German counterpart. The bubble-shaped hood of the Spitfire offered vastly improved all-round visibility, a matter of life and death for a fighter pilot. During the air battles that raged over the Dunkirk beaches, RAF fighters destroyed 132 German aircraft, delivering a devastating blow to Goering's Luftwaffe. Many German attacks did manage to penetrate to the evacuation area and inflict heavy losses on ships and men. But without a doubt, the RAF emerged victorious in the Battle of Dunkirk. At great cost, the RAF had prevented the German bombers from annihilating the British Expeditionary Force along with all of Britain's hopes. Tragically, since the men on the ground had witnessed little of the fierce fighting occurring above them, many concluded that the RAF had abandoned them to their fate. For some time afterward, a significant amount of anger and bitterness developed between the British Army and the RAF pilots. The successful evacuation of 338,000 British and Allied soldiers from Dunkirk marked a turning point in the war. Its impact on British civilian morale was immeasurable, but for the fighter pilots of the RAF, it meant even more. Combat, the only true judge of an aircraft's worth, had proven the Spitfire to be an exceptional warplane. With an attempted invasion of Britain now an impending reality, survival would depend solely on the men and machines of RAF Fighter Command. Within 2 weeks of France's fall, Hitler and his generals began planning the conquest of Britain. Success would hinge primarily on the Luftwaffe winning control of the skies over the Channel and southern England. Hermann Goering, undeterred by his failure at Dunkirk, estimated that it would take only 4 days of intensive air operations by the Luftwaffe to overwhelm Britain's air defenses in the south of England. In just 4 weeks, the RAF could be utterly defeated. In preparation for the campaign, the Luftwaffe assembled 2,800 combat aircraft in France, Denmark, and Norway. Eagle Day, scheduled for early August, was to mark the start of the Great Offensive. Meanwhile, the RAF strength was to be gradually worn down. The bait designed to lure British fighters into costly dogfights with the Luftwaffe consisted of a series of bombing raids on southern English ports and Channel convoys. If the RAF scrambled its fighters to confront the German raiders, they would lose valuable aircraft to the 109 escorts. Conversely, if it chose not to engage, Britain would face significant losses in shipping. The Kanalkampf, as the German High Command dubbed the first phase of the Battle of Britain, began in earnest on July 10, 1940. The first major engagement involved an attack by 20 German bombers and 50 fighters on a convoy codenamed Bread, traversing the Dover Straits. Forewarned by radar, 30 British fighters, including Spitfires from 74 Squadron, intercepted the raiders. Soon after, 6 Spitfires from 64 Squadron joined the fray. In the ensuing dogfights, 3 German bombers were shot down, along with 3 109 fighters. On the British side, the losses included a lone Hurricane and 2 damaged aircraft, while 1 Spitfire made a crash landing. Tragically, 1 RAF pilot lost his life, and only a single ship from the convoy was sunk. For Fighter Command, the outcome of this first day's action was highly satisfactory, setting the stage for the intense battles to come. However, it became evident that adequately protecting all Channel convoys would quickly escalate costs. During the battle in France and over Dunkirk, the RAF had suffered the loss of 477 valuable fighters and nearly as many pilots. Britain now had only 19 squadrons of Spitfires and 29 squadrons of Hurricanes left. With a significant battle looming, Sir Hugh Dowding was determined to conserve his fighter resources, even if that meant allowing British ships to be sunk within sight of the English coast. This decision caused frustration among RAF pilots eager for combat, as future German attacks would be met with only a limited number of fighters. The priority was to focus on destroying German bombers while avoiding engagements with their escorts whenever possible. In the early weeks of the Battle of Britain, Fighter Command's steady accumulation of combat experience led to several valuable modifications for the Spitfire. An increasing number of Spitfires were outfitted with constant speed propellers, enhancing their rate of climb and significantly reducing engine wear. The introduction of the de Wilde incendiary bullet proved to be a valuable asset for marksmanship, greatly increasing the Spitfire's hitting power. Experienced pilots favored a mix of ammunition, loading 2 guns with standard bullets, 2 with armor-piercing rounds, and 2 with incendiary rounds. Many skilled Spitfire pilots believed that using incendiary rounds made the crucial difference between merely damaging an enemy aircraft and shooting it down. In addition to performance enhancements, new Spitfires offered better protection for their pilots. All Spitfires rolling off the production lines were now equipped with armor behind the pilot's seat as standard equipment, improving their chances of survival in the increasingly perilous aerial combat of the Battle of Britain. Just before the war, bulletproof windscreens were introduced for the Spitfires, despite initial reluctance from the Air Ministry. Sir Hugh Dowding, known for his commitment to pilot safety, managed to convince the authorities by arguing that, if bulletproof glass were deemed necessary for Chicago gangsters, it certainly should be for his fighter pilots. These enhancements to the Spitfire were welcomed by the pilots, but there was growing concern about how combat situations were unfolding. The RAF's tactical doctrines, which had remained unchanged since the early 1930s, began to negate many of the Spitfire's inherent advantages. The standard RAF formation was a VIC of 3 aircraft flying in close proximity. This close formation posed a high risk of collision, preventing pilots from effectively scanning their surroundings and taking full advantage of the Spitfire's excellent visibility. As a result, the VIC formations became particularly vulnerable to surprise attacks from enemy aircraft approaching at high speeds from above. Additionally, the tight formation of 3 aircraft was not sustainable during the chaos of aerial combat, often resulting in disintegration as the engagements unfolded. The inability to adapt tactics to the realities of modern air warfare posed a significant challenge for the RAF, especially as the Luftwaffe pressed its advantage. The need for more flexible formations and tactics that leverage the Spitfire's strengths was becoming increasingly apparent. Despite the impressive capabilities of the Spitfire, any pilot flying solo remained exceptionally vulnerable. The Luftwaffe's tactics were significantly more effective for the realities of aerial combat. Their basic formation, known as the Swarm, was a well-spaced finger 4, allowing ample room for maneuvering and maintaining vigilance against enemy threats. In combat scenarios, the Swarm could easily break into flexible pairs, each consisting of a leader and a supporting wingman. By the end of July 1940, after 3 weeks of sporadic engagements over the English Channel and southern England, the RAF had inflicted substantial losses on the Luftwaffe, with 125 German aircraft destroyed. However, the majority of British successes were against German bombers, while the superior tactics employed by Luftwaffe pilots were exacting a toll on RAF fighters. In that same period, 32 Spitfires and 46 Hurricanes were lost, along with the lives of 50 RAF pilots. Despite these losses, changes to British fighter tactics occurred slowly. Many individual commanders began to adapt, moving away from the standard Vic formation in favor of the more effective swarm. This shift marked a gradual evolution in the RAF's approach to combat, as pilots sought to maximize the advantages of teamwork and coordination in the face of the formidable Luftwaffe. Despite the tactical shortcomings of fighter command during the early weeks of the Battle of Britain, individual pilots demonstrated remarkable skill and courage, achieving extraordinary success in their Spitfires. Many of these pilots became legendary figures within the RAF, celebrated for their bravery and impressive combat records. Flight Lieutenant Alan Deere was one such pilot, renowned for his resilience. He not only survived multiple harrowing experiences, including being shot down and executing several forced landings, but also went on to destroy 17 German aircraft during the battle. And he concluded the war as a wing commander with a total of 22 victories. Sailor Malan, a South African ace, gained fame early in the war by shooting down 6 German aircraft within just 7 days during the Battle of France. By the end of the Battle of Britain, he had added 9 more victories to his tally, earning a bar to his DFC. Malan's total kills would reach 32 by 1941, along with recognition that included the Distinguished Service Order, DSO, and bar. Robert Stanford Tuck showcased his versatility by flying both Hurricanes and Spitfires during the battle, achieving a total of 12 confirmed kills. Although he initially showed little aptitude during training, his combat performance highlighted him as an exceptional fighter pilot. By the war's conclusion, Tuck had amassed 29 victories and earned both the DSO and 2 bars to his DFC. As the summer of 1940 transitioned from July to August, the Luftwaffe's assault began to wane. This decline in attacks was attributed not only to periods of adverse weather, but also to the German Air Force consolidating its strength in preparation for a significant offensive. The Luftwaffe's assault on Britain intensified dramatically starting August 12, 1940, marking a critical turning point in the Battle of Britain. The phase began with a series of increasingly severe raids, targeting British radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories, which were essential for the RAF's defense. Eagle Day, as Hermann Goering named August 15, saw the Luftwaffe launch an unprecedented attack, executing more than 1,790 sorties in a single day across 5 major strikes. While RAF pilots demonstrated remarkable bravery, shooting down 75 German aircraft, the cost was steep. Fighter Command lost 30 Spitfires and Hurricanes, along with 17 pilots. By August 18, the situation had become dire, with Fighter Command having lost a total of 183 aircraft in combat, plus 30 more on the ground. These losses exceeded the rate at which the RAF could replace them, leading to a precarious situation. Even more alarming was the attrition of experienced personnel. Losses among squadron and flight commanders reached critical levels, and replacement pilots were being thrust into combat with minimal training. If this pattern of attrition continued, Fighter Command faced the grim reality of being utterly decimated within a matter of weeks. A temporary lull in operations due to bad weather offered little solace, as the Luftwaffe soon resumed its offensive with renewed vigor. Between August 24th and September 6th, they averaged nearly 1,000 sorties a day, relentlessly testing the limits of Fighter Command's endurance. During this harrowing period, RAF pilots fought against overwhelming odds, and the cumulative strain of relentless combat began to take its toll. As Fighter Command faced what seemed to be an inevitable extinction, Sir Hugh Dowding's call for a miracle was answered on September 7, 1940. On that day, 1,000 German aircraft, including over 300 bombers, assembled for the Luftwaffe's first significant raid on London. Adolf Hitler, enraged by recent RAF attacks on Berlin, had ordered Hermann Göring to concentrate efforts on destroying the British capital. While this offensive would bring tragedy to thousands of Londoners, it ultimately became a pivotal turning point for Fighter Command. With the focus of the German air campaign shifting to a single, predictable target, the pressure on RAF airfields was relieved. This change allowed exhausted pilots to reduce the number of sorties they flew while still meeting the Luftwaffe in greater strength. During the second phase of the battle, from September 7 to September 15, RAF fighters could engage the German air fleets with numbers as high as 300 at a time. Luftwaffe airmen, previously confident that the RAF was down to its last 50 Spitfires, were taken aback by the British response. As the Luftwaffe's bombers faced increasing resistance, Hermann Göring, frustrated by his bombers' significant losses, ordered the Messerschmitt 109 escorts to remain close to the bombers at all times. This directive limited the fighters' ability to maneuver freely and left them vulnerable as they were unable to engage in effective dogfights. The Spitfires, with their superior agility and tight turns, were granted a crucial advantage in the ensuing skirmishes. In the 9 days culminating on September 15, the RAF achieved a significant victory, shooting down 321 German aircraft at the cost of 174 British fighters. By this time, British production of Spitfires and Hurricanes had ramped up to the extent that it was outpacing the losses sustained in combat. The implications of this decisive turn in the battle were not lost on Adolf Hitler. The Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority over Britain became evident, and this realization marked a significant shift in the strategic landscape of the war. With the RAF demonstrating resilience and superiority in combat, the Battle of Britain began to turn in the favor of the British, laying the groundwork for continued resistance against the Nazi threat. The Supermarine Spitfire's legacy was solidified during and after the Battle of Britain, where it not only played a crucial role in defending Britain, but also became a symbol of resilience and determination. The Spitfire II introduced significant upgrades over its predecessor, enhancing its combat effectiveness. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin 12 engine, the Spitfire II provided a notable increase in horsepower, reaching 1,175 horsepower, which improved both speed and climb. Mark IIA, while a number of Mark IIBs were equipped with two 20mm Hispano cannon, significantly enhancing its firepower against enemy aircraft. Despite the introduction of the Spitfire II, the next variants, Marks III and IV, did not see full-scale production. In January 1941, the Messerschmitt 109F entered Luftwaffe service, proving significantly superior to the Spitfire II at altitudes above 20,000 feet. In response, Supermarine upgraded the design by fitting the Merlin 45 engine to a strengthened Spitfire 1 airframe, resulting in the creation of the Spitfire 5, which would become the most numerous of all Spitfire marks. The Spitfire 5 entered service in February 1941, boasting a top speed of 375 miles per hour and an operating ceiling of 36,500 feet. To enhance roll rate and speed at low levels, some aircraft featured clipped wingtips. By this time, the various subtypes of the Spitfire were classified based on the type of wing fitted. The A-wing configuration mounted four 303 Browning machine guns, while the B wing could accommodate a single 20mm Hispano cannon alongside 2 machine guns. The C would carry either 2 cannon, 1 cannon with 2 machine guns, with the second cannon muzzle fairing blanked off, or the original 4 machine guns. This adaptability made the Spitfire 5 a formidable adversary in the skies over Europe. This Spitfire 5 played a crucial role in turning the tide during the Battle of Malta in mid-1942. The island, positioned strategically along the Axis lines of communication between North Africa and Italy, was a prime target for German and Italian bombers. The successful defense of Malta established a vital RAF base for offensive operations against Axis airfields. From Malta, the Spitfire made its debut as a fighter bomber during the summer of 1942, with the Mark V C variant serving with great success in the Mediterranean and northern fronts throughout the war. In 1942, Allied airmen increasingly encountered the German Focke-Wulf 190, which decisively outclassed the Spitfire Mark V, the finest fighter in service at that time. Although a small number of Mark VI aircraft had been produced, it was evident that only a radically improved version of the Spitfire could effectively combat the Focke-Wulf threat.
We also had to make sure that we were keeping one step ahead of the enemy. And when the Focke-Wulf 190 came around, we had to increase the maneuverability of the aircraft. We actually added power-assisted ailerons. Like the power-assisted steering you got on your motor car now, but we were doing that on airplanes long before they thought of putting them in motor cars.
Supermarine's response was the introduction of the Mark 7, 8, and 9, with the Mark 9 becoming the most numerous. The Spitfire Mark 9 combined the Merlin 60 series engine with a 5C airframe, featuring a 2-stage supercharger with an aftercooler. This innovation enabled the aircraft to achieve a top speed of over 400 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 44,000 feet. In 1944, many Mark 9s were upgraded with a new wing design known as the E-type, which housed a 20mm cannon and a 50 caliber machine gun. No German or Japanese aircraft could withstand the firepower of 2 50 caliber machine guns, and combined with the Mark 9's exceptional performance, this made it an immensely powerful fighter. The Mark 9 Spitfire remained in production long after it had been outperformed by newer variants. By the end of the war, a total of 5,739 Mark 9s had been built. Among these, one of the most unusual was a seaplane conversion that successfully completed trials in 1943, reminiscent of the Spitfire's origins in the Schneider Cup races. However, this seaplane variant was never put into production. Following the Mark 9, the next significant development was the Mark 14, which was powered by a Rolls-Royce Griffin engine. The Griffin had been first fitted to an experimental Spitfire Mark IV in late 1941. The Mark 14 was introduced in October 1944 and featured a Griffin 65 engine rated at 2,035 horsepower, necessitating a 5-bladed propeller to harness its immense power. The Mark 14 boasted a maximum speed of 439 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 43,000 feet, making it undoubtedly the most potent Spitfire of the war. It also marked the final evolution of the Spitfire during World War II. The Spitfire Mark 18, a strengthened and upgraded variant of the Mark 14, was introduced just as the war came to an end. It represented the latest fighter development of the original Spitfire airframe. Subsequent variants, the Spitfires 21 to 24, were nearly entirely new aircraft, sharing few components with their predecessors. Even Reginald Mitchell's original wing design underwent radical changes. In March 1954, Mark 18Es flew the final offensive sorties by Spitfires in RAF service in Malaya, marking the end of a remarkable career that lasted an astonishing 16 years. This legacy stands as a testament to one of the most inspired designs in the history of military aviation.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
The only reason for an airplane to exist is to go fast. At the Great Air Meet in Rheims, Glenn Curtis set a world's record of just over 43 miles an hour, and the quest for speed was on. In 1913, Maurice Prévost was flying a streamlined Dépôt-Dessin monoplane at 126 miles an hour, and Europe claimed the lead in aviation speed. Immediately after World War I, quest for speed became a catalyst for the development of fighter planes. Countries which had not invested in new engines for their wartime fighters would, for reasons of national pride, invest in new engines to race them peacetime. Then, in America in the 1930s, the situation reversed itself. Civilian aircraft, like the Travel Air Mystery Ship and the GB, Waddell Williams racers, became even faster than military aircraft. The reason was simple. Same engines were available to both civil racers and military fighters. The fighters had to carry guns, bombs, oxygen, and radios, while the racers were built only for speed. The world's absolute speed record was passed from country to country. And as the racers became faster and more powerful, they also became more expensive. America's Howard Hughes could afford to build his own racer, and with it set a land-plane speed record.
but the absolute speed record of 440 miles an hour was set by a Macchi MC-72 seaplane in 1934, financed by the Italian government. Then military aircraft came back into the lead as the Heinkel and Messerschmitt firms competed for the title. Messerschmitt Bf-109R set a speed record of 469 miles an hour in 1939, a record that lasted for many years. When the jet aircraft came out, speed records rapidly accelerated, the British breaking 1,000 miles an hour in 1956 in a Fairey Delta II. Speeds continued to climb, finally reaching 2,193 miles an hour in 1976 by the Lockheed SR-71, alias Blackbird. While speed was the object, there were many other benefits in creating ever faster aircraft. Improvement in fuels, streamlining, lubricants, materials, and the list goes on. Speed produced not only prestige and pleasure, but also utility. The speed record setters ultimately paved the way for commercial transports, business jets, and private plane.
It had slight sweep back on the wings, 18 degrees of sweep. And it had many innovative features. For example, it had powered controls on the ailerons, which were unusual. We didn't have that at that stage in the war in any Allied aircraft.
Now Luftwaffe officials are eager to take another look. When Dornier tells Milch that the aircraft flies at over 470 miles per hour, the Air Force chief, knowing Dornier is a man of his word, agrees to the project. It is there where the